Hi everyone, I'm Sophie. I'm joined by my co-host Savitri, and Millie's also here. She's helping us with tech behind the scenes. Welcome to today's National Tea Book Club broadcast. We're so pleased that you're joining us today. We have Sophie Cameron joining us, and Savitri's going to run through her bio.
Yes, Sophie is a YA and middle grade author from the Scottish Highlands. She studied French and Comparative Literature at the University of Edinburgh and has a postgraduate certificate in creative writing from Newcastle University. Her debut novel, Out of the Blue, was nominated for the Carnegie Medal in 2019, and she lives in Spain now with her family.
So Sophie is joining us for our second of 6 author talks, which are linked to our hero read for the term, which is Charlotte Bronte's Gothic classic Jane Eyre and Patrice Lawrence's abridged retelling of the story. Like Jane Eyre, the protagonists in Sophie's book Away with Words are outsiders trying to find their voice and themselves. They're also quite different books in terms of format, so we'll be exploring the common themes alongside the dissimilar style.
We're going to speak to Sophie now about her books, recommended reads and career today. And you may have to scroll down a little bit to see this, but you can submit questions. You can also do that via the QR code on screen or by typing in the code online. The QA function will be open throughout the discussion, so you can join in at any time. And if you're experiencing any issues with the stream, please let us know there so we can try to support.
So welcome, Sophie. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really nice to be here to talk to you all.
Great. Let's get started on the first question. So can you tell us a bit about your book, please, Away with Words?
Sure. So Away with Words is set in a world where words physically appear from people's mouths as they speak. So as they're talking, words just fall to the ground or to the desk or table or whatever's nearby. And they eventually disappear, but before then people have to sweep them away. So it's this world where speech has this visual and physical aspect to it, as well as an auditory one. And the main character is an 11-year-old girl called Gala, who has just moved from Cadaqués, which is a town in Catalonia in the northeast of Spain, to a town called Fortrose, which is in the northeast of Scotland, and is actually where I grew up. So when she first moves, Gala is really unhappy with the situation. She doesn't want to be there. She doesn't want to leave her friends or family back in Spain. And she's also having difficulty adapting, partly because she isn't fluent in English yet. And in this world, she's physically surrounded by all these words that she can't understand, and it's really overwhelming for her. But then she makes friends with a girl called Natalie, who has selective mutism. So she doesn't speak in certain situations, including at school. But Natalie loves words, she loves language, and she collects other people's words that they've discarded around school or from the street, and she uses them in creative ways. So it's about Gala and Natalie's friendship, really, about how they build this friendship across the language barrier, and how Gala slowly adapts to her new environment. And the idea really came from my own experience of learning languages. I've always loved studying languages. I studied French at university, and I live in Spain now, as you mentioned. So I speak Spanish and Catalan, which are Gala's first languages. And so it really came from this idea of like the frustration of wanting to speak and it not coming out like exactly as you hoped, or just like the difficulties of communicating. So yeah, that's something that I've wanted to explore in a novel for a long time, and yeah, this is the result. Away with Words.
Amazing. Well, you've sort of answered one of our first questions from a school, which was, where did you get the inspiration for Away with Words? So I'm going to skip to the next one, which is, do you like being an author? The school hasn't told us who that has come from, so please do let us know if you want us to shout your school out, or the individual who's posted the question. But yeah, do you like being an author, Sophie?
Sure, yeah, I do. I love being an author. I feel really lucky to be able to share these stories, because obviously anyone can be an author, anyone can write stories, but it's really lucky to be in a position where I'm able to sort of share them with so many readers, and get feedback on them, and it's always so interesting to hear what people feel and think about my stories, and how they interpret them too, because sometimes sometimes people's interpretations are so different from what I intended. So yeah, I love being an author, and I think it's I'm very, very lucky to be in this position to be able to keep doing it for a while longer, hopefully.
That's great. Thank you, Sophie. And what was your journey to becoming published? Can you talk to us about that, please?
I was actually really lucky with my publishing journey. I wrote my first book, Away with Words, Out of the Blue, in 2016. And I submitted it to lots of different competitions. And I actually did that to encourage myself to finish it. And then it was longlisted for one, and I hadn't finished the manuscript, so I had to rush to finish it before I sent it away. But one of those competitions was run by an association called the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, which is known as Scooby. And every 2 years, they produce an anthology of, I think, 12 writers and 12 illustrators, and they publish a first chapter from the writers and illustrations from the illustrators, and they send that to agents and to publishers around in the UK and the US mostly. So I was really lucky because agents then got in touch with me, saying that they were interested in representing Out of the Blue. So at that stage, I didn't need to query anyone, and then we went out on submission with it. And it was picked up by Macmillan Children's Books. So that was really, really like a really lucky start. But it doesn't, unfortunately, mean that I've never had any rejection in my career. Like, I've written books since which haven't sold. I've had to change agents a few times as well. So rejection is very much like a given in any creative career, but and especially in publishing. Even if you do have like a great start, it doesn't mean it's going to be plain sailing. But yeah, it was a very, very lucky beginning to my career.
Thanks. That's probably, and we've got so many questions, but that's probably a good point for a great question from Ling Hall School. Thank you for this. When you get discouraged in your writing, how do you find the motivation to keep going or to find new ideas?
That is a really good question, because I think it is something that every writer or creative person like goes through. Like writing a novel is like such a roller coaster. I usually find it's like great, and I'm like, oh, this is the best idea I've ever had. It's going to be so good, and then I get to 30,000 words, and I'm like, oh, this is terrible. Like, how could I have thought this was good? Now I just try and push through and finish it, because what I found, like when I first started writing, like before I was published, is that I would get to that point and then think like, oh, this idea is no good, so I'll start something else. But then what you end up with is like 10 unfinished stories and like nothing that you can actually like work on or submit to anybody. So now I just really try and push through. But I do think as well, if you are really not enjoying something, it is good to take a break and step back from it. Like if it becomes too much of a struggle, then take some time away from it and write something else. And I find that usually when you come back to it with a sort of a fresh outlook, it's never as bad as you thought. And it can be, and that time away can like let you see it in a new light. And also just sometimes you just have to take time off like writing like whatsoever. I know a lot of authors really try and stick to like, they write every single day and they try to get like 500 or 1,000 words done every day. But I mean, everyone's different, and I find as well, sometimes if I just have like a couple of weeks to just watch terrible TV or read books as well, that I can come back to it with a sort of fresh mindset. But yeah, I think understanding that it is part of the process. Getting discouraged is definitely part of the process, and just trying to like roll with that as much as you can.
And in those moments, or maybe even before, did you ever consider any other career paths? What would you have been if you weren't a writer?
Well, I do. I actually have like a part-time job. I work for a communications agency in Barcelona in the mornings, and I mostly write copy for websites and for emails and for different events in Barcelona. But I also do quite a lot of translation. And if I hadn't been a writer, I think I probably would have tried to get into literary translation, which I don't know if I would have been very good at it, because I think it's so difficult, especially translators who are sort of transporting this entire story from such a different language and sometimes a very different culture as well into another language. I think it's like very impressive. But I think I would have tried to do that, because I think that has the same focus on language, and it's very creative as well. I think it's a very creative process to be able to do that. So I think I would have tried that.
Thanks. That's an amazing point. I'm sure we'll have people on the call who are interested in pursuing, a career in a dual language, or people who are already bilingual who are thinking, gosh, I hadn't thought of that. And that's a direction I could take that in. I'm going to take it in a completely different direction in a minute now, though. Is a Gothic classic, such as Jane Eyre, then the sort of book you would read for pleasure?
When I was younger, I read a lot of the Gothic classics, really like the big names, the sort of 19th century ones like Dracula, Portrait of Dorian Gray. I really enjoyed. So I read quite a lot of those, and what I took away from them mostly is like the sense of place and the atmosphere of these novels. That's something that I think it's always really stands out from those. These days, I don't tend to go for Gothic fiction like as my first choice, but I do often find that I like sort of more contemporary fiction, but that has like those Gothic elements in it. For example, like In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado, I read that recently, and it's not even a novel, it's a memoir, but each chapter is written in a different narrative style, and I think there's really like strong Gothic elements in that, in terms of like the atmosphere and the kind of image of the dream house as this Gothic trope. So I definitely enjoy like the elements of it within contemporary literature. But I did enjoy the classics when I read them back in my youth.
Are there any sort of genres or stories that influence your writing then? And you could talk about books, film, and TV, so across different storytelling. We know that AI is the focus of one of your books, so yeah, could you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, that one, Our Sister Again, which was my book before We Have Words, that was really inspired by film and TV more than anything. There's so many stories about AI and how humans react to AI and robots. And I really got the idea from the TV show Humans, which was a Channel 4 show from a few years ago, where these like ultra realistic robots are introduced to society, first as sort of like home helpers, but then they sort of become more like their intelligence grows and they want to become independent. And I thought that was really interesting, and I wanted to sort of focus in on a family and who are going through a bereavement, and how this sort of ultra realistic AI version of their it's their oldest daughter, how they would like, if they could accept her as a human, and to what extent can someone like a robot like that be considered human? Like, what does it mean to be a human? So yes, I do get a lot of inspiration from TV as well. I tend to like in films and books as well. I usually like stories where it's set in the real world, in a very sort of realistic contemporary setting, but then there's this one element which is like something strange happens, or there's something odd about it. For example, like The Leftovers, which is a book and a TV series, which is about set in the contemporary world, and then one day, I think it's like 1.7% of the population just disappears, and everyone else is left to sort of wonder what happened. And it's about how people cope with the uncertainty. And I think that's really like the stuff I write as well. Like, I like to write about real places most of the time, or most of my books are set. All my books so far are set like in Scotland, in places that I know really well, like Edinburgh or the Highlands. But then there's like this one fantastical or sci-fi element which is sort of woven into the story. So that tends to be what I look for in stories as well, but there's exceptions too. I like a lot of like sort of more like straightforward contemporary literature too. But whenever I try and write that, I just find that like something weird happens, like against my will sometimes. Like that tends to be what I'm drawn to. And TV, I think, as much as books, is a big inspiration and a big like well of ideas for me. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Well, I mean, I know Sophie was a fan of The Leftovers, and I remember watching Humans. You're also reminding me of Clara and the Sun, I think.
I love that book.
Yeah. So, well, let's move on to then other books. You can name names. If somebody likes the sound of your books, or what could you recommend? And we can talk about poetry as well here, because we're going to come on to that in a sec.
Yeah. If someone likes A Way with Words, I think my sort of go-to recommendation is a book from, I think it's from like 2016. It's called Sophie Someone by Hayley Long, which is about a girl called Sophie who has been brought up in Belgium. She moved with her family from England to Belgium when she was very young, but she doesn't. There's something like strange about her family story. She doesn't really understand like why they moved. There's a lot of sort of secrecy between her parents, and they've never told her the real reason. But also because Sophie, the character, is dyslexic, and she within the text, like she kind of substitutes words for other ones. Like she says like pigeon instead of person, and like mixes things up. But it's really creative, and it takes like a minute to sort of get your head around it. But when you do, you kind of like tune into her sort of the way she speaks in her language. So I think that sort of has that similar theme of like someone who's an outsider and like and is trying to work at their identity in this like different place, but also the sort of like playfulness around language and like the focus on language. Also, yeah, you mentioned poetry as well. A Way with Words features quite a lot of features some poetry that Gala and Natalie write. They start using the discarded words to create their own poems. I'm actually, I don't consider myself a poet at all. I really love poetry, but it's not something that I write. But I wanted to include that poetry, as it's like a written form that sort of focuses on the visual a lot, as well as how it sounds and how it looks quite often go together. So I think other recommendations might actually be verse novels, even though Way with Words isn't a verse novel. I think I would recommend people who enjoyed it to look at those. For example, Crossing the Line by Tia Fisher. Which it's a verse novel I really enjoyed recently, and it's very different, but she sort of incorporates elements of like concrete poetry. So some of the chapters the words will like create images, and it's really clever, and it's just a really good read as well. It's an excellent book.
Thank you for those recommendations, Sophie. And it's National Poetry Day tomorrow as well. So thank you for talking about poetry and verse novels. We have got some questions coming in from schools. Hepburn Comprehensive. Did your time at school inspire you to be a writer? Did you enjoy English at school?
I did enjoy English. Yeah, I had a really good English teacher called Brian Johnson, who took us through a lot of like great books, but would also kind of go off the curriculum quite a lot, probably more than he was supposed to. And he introduced us to a lot of great films. And so I think there was a real sort of focus on like all sorts of stories as being, worthwhile and valid within those lessons. And but we did read a lot of classics. We did a lot of Shakespeare. So I feel like quite lucky to have had that sort of introduction to literature. But I do think as well, like I know a lot of writers who didn't particularly enjoy English, or it wasn't their best subject at school, and it's something that they came to later in life. So I do think like it's though a lot of authors I think have been big readers from a young age, it's definitely something that a lot of people come into later on in life. So if English maybe isn't someone's best subject, I think that shouldn't put them off, trying to, write and express themselves however they want, if it's something they enjoy.
Great, thanks. Well, that probably links in again with something that I know as an artist, Sophie, our Sophie, is also quite keen on, which is the sort of expression in that your characters explore in the book. So A Way with Words shows us how words can hurt or can unite, and how art and creative writing can help express yourself. So obviously one of the characters has elective mutism. What did you want the reader to take away from that? We noticed that obviously Jane Eyre sort of has some very famous speeches in the book about wanting to be heard, and isn't as an orphan and a sort of slightly perceived less important member of society. But she does find expression through books and through art. So What did you want for the reader from that?
Well, I think in terms of Natalie's character, Natalie is Gala's friend who has selective mutism, and so for me it was important to kind of really give her that means of expressing herself through the words that she collects, because she feels that she's often like not sort of people kind of make assumptions about her. They think because she's not speaking that she doesn't have anything to say or that she's not interested, whereas actually it's her selective mutism is an anxiety response, and she physically can't speak in certain situations because of her anxiety. But that's not a reflection on what's going on in her head. So so for her, this to be able to kind of play around with words, and she and Gala start sending sort of messages to other people in their year at school. They create these poems and they sort of leave them for people who are going through a hard time, or they see that someone's experiencing some sort of difficulty. They try and connect with them through that way. So it's this exploration of the written form as being like a means of connection for those who have difficulty speaking, and obviously that ties in with Gala as well. She has trouble understanding what's being said around her a lot of the time, but being able to read can often make it easier. Like sometimes she doesn't hear the word, but she'll see it. So it was really just this focus on the written words, or as like a sort of creative outlet for them, which obviously I think a lot of people who enjoy writing probably relate to that too. Maybe authors, well, some authors are extremely extremely extroverted, but I'm not personally. So for me, it feels much more natural to be able to express myself through writing than it would be through speech, most of the time anyway.
And so when you're writing, how do you nurture creativity? How do you make sure that spark is kept alive?
I guess it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, where I think it's important for me to kind of take breaks and step back. At the moment, I don't really have sort of a routine, because I have my part-time job, and I also have 2 kids they're 4, so quite a lot of my time is taken up with the sort of day-to-day things, and I just fit in writing whenever I can. Sometimes I'll do a bit in the morning, sometimes I'll do a bit in the evening if I'm not too tired. So it can be difficult to sort of really get in the zone and really sort of dive into a story and get really into it. So I try and just sort of do as much as I can, not push it too much, because I find that if you sort of try and push it too much, you're often not producing your best work. And just sort of take a step back when you need to, and and also just try and find inspiration in other works, like other books or TV shows, or sometimes just getting out and for a walk and things too. You can actually come up with your best ideas if you're just completely remove yourself from the story. Just trying to find that balance, I think, is a tricky thing. But
oh, thanks. There's a question I really want to ask, which would make sense after that one, but I've also got another really good question from Heben Comprehensive. You've talked a lot there about some of the challenges that can get in the way of a writing life. You have to work around, etc. You've also said some things that will be really relatable for young people wanting to write. But are there any specific tips for an aspiring writer of school age?
School age. I think I kind of find that for me anyway, I think the books that I read as when I was that age, I think really formed the sort of foundations of the way I write now. So I, for example, I had a teacher who recommended Isabel Allende to me, who's a Chilean author who writes mostly magical realism. And she recommended her book, The House of the Spirits, which is, set in sort of real world Chile, but has these elements of magic woven into it. And I think that was really influential for me. And I think a lot of people would probably say that this sort of thing, the books that they wrote when they were a child or a teenager, really sort of formed the basis of the kind of writing they do. So I think to try and read as widely as possible is always, it's always my would be my main advice, because you can get ideas and inspiration from so many different sources, and things feed into each other as well. Like, even if you don't end up writing like horror books, for example, you might really enjoy like certain aspects of those, and it can inspire your work in other ways. My other thing would be competitions, because there's a lot of competitions for young writers, and I think those can be really, even if you don't win, I think just having a deadline to work to can be really helpful for finishing things. And also sometimes you can get feedback from someone who's like impartial and is going to give you like their honest opinion, and I think those can be really helpful, just to kind of establish a good sort of creative routine, or just get yourself into the habit of doing these things. And I think another thing would be, I went to a workshop with the author Juno Dawson before I was published, and her advice was to think of yourself as an author, and that was something that really like changed the way that I approached my writing at the time, because if you think of yourself as an author or a writer, and not like an aspiring author or a wannabe author, but actually as an author, you tend to like take yourself more seriously, and for that really like helped me sort of prioritize having that time to write, and make sure like I carved out that time and considered it like almost like a job, like this is something that I have to do, even though at that stage I wasn't, published or earning any money from it. So I think, to try and take yourself seriously, this is really something that you want to do, and remember that your voice is important, and there will be like plenty of people who want to hear your stories.
That's great. Thank you, Sophie. And thank you everyone again for getting your questions in. We've only got about 15 minutes left. So if you've got anything that you want to ask, do get them in now while you've got the chance to ask your questions directly to Sophie. Sophie, is there a book or story that has impacted you or meant something to you in some way? I'm sure A Way with Words has impacted many people, myself included.
Oh, there's so many books that have really been like really influential. I think going back to the ones that I read when I was in school, which I think a lot of those are the ones that sort of have really stayed with me and inspired what I write today, especially because I'm writing for young people mostly. So Skellig by David Almond, I think, is one that has always stuck with me, and it's that blend of the very normal contemporary setting with this like one fantastical element, and just the fact that this angel appears, and but he likes Chinese food, and it's that the contrast between the sort of like kind of almost gritty real world, and then this like fantastical unexplained phenomena as well. That's something that really stayed with me. I also really loved the His Dark Materials trilogy. I think that was maybe I read the first one when I was 9, and I think I just remember thinking like, this is what I want to do. Like, this is, I want to like create these worlds and create these stories too. So those are the ones that really stick out as being very impactful.
Thank you. That's great. So those are some of the lovely sort of familiar bits of a writer's life. The reading bit, the taking that on. We've talked a little bit about the the sort of getting the book done. The next stage, you touched earlier on, not every writer is a massive extrovert, but obviously young people are familiar. The world is expecting us now to sort of put ourselves out there a lot more, a bit of hustle, a bit of self-promotion. You've talked about entering competitions. How did you find that end of the work? And do you have any advice for young people there?
I think generally, I think, try not to like force what doesn't feel natural. Like, there are authors who are really great at social media, for example, and like, build this like excellent social media presence. But I think if it's something that you're really forcing and doesn't feel right for you, like, people will be able to tell that, and they're not really going to engage with it in the way you're hoping. So that side can be difficult, I think, especially now authors are kind of expected to sort of promote themselves and their books online a lot, and for in terms of like authors for children, the sort of it can be quite challenging to do school visits and stuff if people are expecting someone who's like a real big extroverted character. And I have met lots of authors like that and who are excellent at it, who are really, really great, but that's not who I'm gonna be. And like, as much as I'd like to, I don't think I could ever pull that off. So, but I actually love doing school visits. I love being able to meeting young people who've read the books and who are interested in literature, and and chatting to them about it. But I think if I were to try and be like a big sort of extroverted performer, like they'd be able to tell it was like too forced. And so I think just do what feels like right for you and your for your personality type. But yeah, that is like one of the more challenging aspects, I think, especially the sort of online, like sorry, the plane going overhead. One of the sort of promotional aspect, and it's why I would never do self-publishing, because I think that's like a great a way for people to get their stories out there, but you really have to promote a lot, and you have to sort of take charge of that. So yeah, I'm glad to have people at my publishers who help with that, who do most of it, to be honest, and I just do what I can.
Thank you, Sophie. We've got a question from a school. Did you like to read a lot when you were at school? So you spoke about reading quite widely. Was that an interest that grew, or one that you had initially?
It was. I've always been like a big reader from when I was really young. I really loved reading books all through primary school, but then and through most of secondary school too. When I was about 15, 16, I had a different English teacher who and we studied a couple of books which I don't know, something put me off reading a bit at that stage, and I don't know if it's just because I had maybe other things were more interesting to me at that time, but there was a few years where I sort of fell away from it, and I think part of it was that we were maybe reading at a certain point in school, we were reading books that weren't super interesting to me, and we took so long to read them too. It would be like months and months and months of reading this one book. So I think, yes, I do actually think like who you have as a teacher can be so can really change your experience in that sense. But luckily I got back into it, but afterwards, and yeah, and also like I because I had like other teachers who I think really sort of helped me before and afterwards, who helped me find like books that were more to my liking, and that that teacher I mentioned who introduced me to Isabel Allende, for example, that was in my last year of school, and from there I studied I went on to study French and Comparative Literature, and I studied a lot of like magical realism in particular, because that was something that I enjoyed. But yeah, generally I have, for most of my life, I've always been a big reader.
Thanks. That's a really great. We never talk much about books that we don't enjoy, but for obvious reasons, But it is one of the challenges that actually you can admire a book, you can see the merits in it, but it may not be one you'd pick for you. So one of the things we definitely want for people on book club is to recognise there's definitely other reads out there. It's fine, you can study a book, you can get something out of it, but that's maybe not one that's going to sort of touch your heart. So sticking with the same age range, how old were you when you wrote your first book?
Well, I started writing when I was like after university. I wrote stories when I was like a teenager as well. I wrote my first novel when I was about 15 or 16. I hesitate to call it a novel because it was not good. It was very, very it was very dramatic. Like any sort of trauma or issue that you can imagine was shoved into this 60,000 word manuscript. So my first like real manuscript, my first real book that I finished, I think was like the one that went on to be my debut novel, Out of the Blue. So I think I was 27 when I finished that. So, which I think for YA authors is probably like on the older end of the scale. Like a lot of YA authors like are actually quite young when they when they like older teenagers or sort of early 20s when they finish. But then that saying, there are also people who start writing for children much later in life, and do so brilliantly as well. There's not an age limit to it.
I'm sure there are lots of people who have reread Jane Eyre through their life. Is there a book that you have reread more than once?
There's a few. The main one is a book called Naive Super, which is a Norwegian book. And it's a very short book. I think it's maybe about like 150 pages. And it's about a man in his 20s who has a sort of breakdown and sort of strips back his life and goes back to basics. And he starts playing with like a children's toy, like a wooden toy, just to sort of, and then like slowly like rebuilds his life again, which sounds a bit odd when I put it like that, but it's a real sort of comfort read. And I think it's if I'm feeling like anxious, then it's a really nice book to go back to, and there's something just like very like calming and soothing about it. So that's one that I have like gone back to lots of times in my life. I've also recently I've reread quite a lot of the books that I read when I was younger. Like I mentioned Skellig and the His Dark Materials trilogy. So I've gone back to quite a lot of those as an adult as well. And it's always interesting to see how you sort of interpret them differently, or different parts of the story will stick out to you at different ages. So that's always quite interesting to do as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. Sophie, I am one of the people who has reread Jane Eyre. At least twice I've reread it, and I'm thinking maybe over Christmas that could be a nice thing to do, or Wuthering Heights. We've got some great questions from some schools, so I just want to make sure we do get through those before the session has to end, which is quite soon, by the way. So if you have a question you've been sitting on, please get it in the chat as soon as you can. McLaren School are wondering, how long did it take you to write Away with Words?
This is always quite a tricky question to answer, because like the first draft of a book, I think usually takes me about 3 or 4 months. Away with Words is quite short compared to my other books. I think it was probably about 3 months to write like the first version. But then after that, I went to my editors, and they read it and then get back to me with suggestions and changes. And then usually we'll do like 2 rounds of edits, and then it'll go to a copy editor, who's the person who looks for inconsistencies or mistakes within the text, and then you work through it again. So the whole process is maybe a year, or maybe slightly less actually. I didn't do that many edits on Away with Words, but I think the first draft was about 3 months. It was actually, like, I think of all my books, it's like one of the easier ones for me to write, and probably the one that I enjoyed most, because it's I've always been so like obsessed with languages and so fascinated by language learning and that as a process, that it was like I really enjoyed just being able to write the story, and thinking about Gallus in sort of arc as she becomes slowly more accustomed to her surroundings and slowly gets better at the language, and the ups and downs for her. And also it's set where I grew up in the northeast of Scotland, in Fortrose. So that was really nice too. That was the first time I'd written a book set there. And I started writing it during COVID, when I couldn't go back there too. So I think that was quite nice to just be able to visit it in my memories and in my head as I was doing that.
And we've got 2 questions that kind of link now, so I'll try and put them together. Hepburn Comprehensive would like to know, how do you plan your stories? And to add on to that, McLaren High School have asked, can you explain the process of how you come up with and develop your characters?
Well, writers quite often talk about 2 categories of writers, like plotters and pantsers. And a plotter is someone who really obviously like plans out every aspect of the story, and the pantser is someone who just like sits down and writes off the top of their head. So I'm definitely more of a plotter. I try and work out the sort of overarching storyline, like the beginning, the middle, and the end. And then usually the concept is what comes to me first. So for Away with Words, for example, it was, okay, this is a world where words physically appear. And then from there I think about like, well, what kind of character would I be able to write an interesting story about within this world? So it was like someone who's learning a second language. So I tend to develop the characters based on the sort of situation that they're going to find themselves in, and then and Gala was one that really sort of came to me quite quickly. Like I kind of felt like I knew who she was. I knew what her sort of arc was going to be because of the situation that she's going to find herself in. So I usually, once I have my sort of overarching story, I start writing, and I have a kind of weird way of writing where I will just write a chapter, as much as I can get from a chapter, and then I move on to the next one, and then the next one, and then I'll try and have 500 words of each chapter, and then 1,000 words of each chapter, and then 1,500 words of each chapter, until it slowly builds up into a full manuscript. But then I can never plot anything 100%, because you sit down and write it out, but then once you actually start writing, the pacing might not be right, or the sort of emotional arc might not feel right. So I always have to kind of go back and rework things afterwards. So I'd say I'm definitely more of a sort of plotter, but I can't plan everything out to in full detail either. So it always takes a bit of reworking halfway through.
Wow, thank you for that. We're on to what is potentially our last question, unless any school slips a very, very quick one in whilst I'm talking. So do you have any advice for young people or your younger self, around achievements or success? So tips for creating a career success story.
I think in terms of creating success, the more you can think of success and achievements as something sort of individual to you, without comparing yourself to other people, I think the more sort of satisfaction you'll be able to gain from it. For me, for example, my goals before I was published were really to have a book on the shelves in bookshops, and to be able to go into a bookshop and see a book there, and also to write what one person would consider their favorite book. And a few people have told me that they considered one of my books their favorite, and luckily, I can go into bookshops. But it's very easy for the goalpost to shift when you're in a creative industry. So, if you start comparing yourself to someone who has a £1 million book deal, or someone who has a Netflix adaptation, or even things lots of translations into different languages, your own achievements can start to seem quite small in comparison. So I really try and sort of bring it back to, what was I trying to achieve, and that is that's an achievement, regardless of what anyone else does. And I think as well, in creative industries, if you try and remember that the things you're producing, their value is not defined by sort of external factors. Your stories, or your art, or your music, or whatever you're creating, if it has worth regardless of whether or not someone else likes it, because there are amazing stories that never get published because they just aren't fitting for the market at that time, or maybe there's something else which is too similar. So the more you can try and think of it as decide what your goals are as an individual, and try not to compare yourself too much to other people around you, or rely too much on what the industry that you're going into expects. I think the more you can do that, the more you'll be able to sort of feel successful and from what you're doing.
Oh, thank you, Sophie. That's such great advice, and thank you so much for all your answers today, and for your time joining us all the way from Spain. I think this is about to be all we've got time for, so we're just going to wrap the session up. But thank you again so much for your book and for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for tuning in today. A feedback form will be shared with you soon via email, so we'd really appreciate both students and school staff completing this. I hope you enjoyed the session and the Q&A with Sophie. We hope to see you at our other sessions as well for NTBC Jane Eyre, which are all on screen now. Please head to our National Teen Book Club webpage for more information and to register your groups. You can also find more broadcasts on the Speakers for Schools website, and we'll be sharing Discover Creative Careers event information in our upcoming emails as well. There's absolutely loads to get involved with for Discover Creative Careers, including our next 2 upcoming National Teen Book Club sessions, which fall into the Careers Month. And we're also hosting a publishing panel event on the 7th of November at 2 till 3 p.m. That's with Faber. So we have a few speakers from different departments from Faber joining us for that. Hope to see you soon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us.